Imagine opening your phone tomorrow morning and seeing three numbers at once. Oil, $147 a barrel. Gas prices surging. National debt climbing by billions every single day. And yet, Congress is still debating whether America is truly at war.
That sounds absurd. But modern wars often begin that way. Not with declarations, not with dramatic speeches. Just a slow slide. A few airstrikes, a naval deployment, emergency funding.
Then suddenly, months later, everyone realizes the meter never stopped running. And right now, that meter is running in the Middle East. The question is no longer whether conflict costs money. The question is whether the United States is quietly entering another trillion-dollar war before most people even notice. Because history has seen this movie before.
In 2003, the Iraq War was sold as a relatively short operation. Early estimates suggested costs in the tens of billions. The final bill? Depending on how you count veterans' care, interest payments, and long-term obligations, economists estimate several $1 trillion. The war ended. The invoices did not. Now, fast forward.
The current Iran conflict looks different on television. More drones, more missiles, more technology. Less footage of soldiers marching through deserts. It feels cleaner, more precise.
Almost cheaper. But wars have a strange habit. They advertise their opening costs, not their final ones. According to public finance experts, the current conflict is already costing America billions every week, with some estimates suggesting roughly $2 billion per day during peak operations.
$2 billion every day. That sounds like an abstract number until you break it down. A single advanced missile interceptor can cost millions. A modern fighter jet can cost tens of thousands of dollars per flight hour.
Carrier strike groups consume extraordinary amounts of fuel, maintenance, logistics, and manpower. And unlike video games, military equipment doesn't magically regenerate after use. Every missile launched must eventually be replaced, usually at a higher cost than before. Here's where things become more interesting. Because the real bill is not just military spending. The real bill begins with oil. Specifically, one narrow stretch of water called the Strait of Hormuz. On a map, it looks almost insignificant, a thin passage between Iran and Oman.
But roughly 1/5 of global oil flows through that choke point. 20%, one waterway. Which means a conflict there doesn't stay there. If shipping slows, oil prices rise.
If oil prices rise, transportation becomes more expensive, then manufacturing, then food, then airline tickets, then nearly everything else.
Because modern economies run on energy, whether people notice it or not. When oil moves, economies move. When oil stalls, inflation follows. That is why markets watch the Strait of Hormuz with the same intensity that traders watch central banks. A missile launched in the Gulf can eventually affect grocery bills in Ohio.
That sounds dramatic. It's also how global supply chains work. And here's the uncomfortable irony. America produces enormous amounts of oil. Some politicians argue higher oil prices help the United States.
Technically, certain producers benefit. Oil companies make more money. Energy states receive more revenue. But consumers experience the opposite. Gas becomes more expensive, businesses face higher costs, inflation returns, and suddenly the Federal Reserve faces a nightmare scenario.
Growth slows, prices rise, the economy gets squeezed from both sides. Economists call that stagflation. Normal people call it everything feeling worse at the same time.
Now add government borrowing. Because wars rarely arrive with cash already saved, they arrive with debt. The United States is already carrying national debt levels that would have sounded impossible a generation ago. So when military spending increases, Washington generally doesn't pause and ask taxpayers for immediate payment. Instead, it borrows. Treasury bonds are issued, investors buy them, interest accumulates. The war gets funded today, the bill arrives later, sometimes decades later. This is where the math becomes uncomfortable. Imagine a conflict that ultimately costs $1 trillion. That headline alone sounds enormous, but it ignores interest. Borrowed money has a habit of multiplying, while politicians move on to the next crisis. The war can end, while the payments continue. Veterans require health care. Equipment must be replaced. Debt servicing expands. Future taxpayers inherit obligations they never voted for. Wars have long tails. Financially, they often outlive the presidents who started them. And then there's another layer, one that rarely gets discussed: markets. Investors don't just react to bombs, they react to uncertainty. Companies delay investments, shipping insurers raise premiums, factories reconsider supply chains. Global capital becomes cautious. Even countries thousands of miles away start adjusting behavior. We've already seen warnings that prolonged disruptions in Hormuz could create recession risks for major oil importers while slowing global growth.
That means this isn't only a military story. It's an economic story, a debt story, an inflation story, a confidence story. And confidence is fragile because modern financial systems run on expectations. People invest because they expect stability. Currencies hold value because people expect governments to remain functional. Markets rise because investors believe tomorrow will roughly resemble today.
Wars attack those assumptions, sometimes more effectively than they attack infrastructure. Now, zoom out. This is where the conversation becomes less about missiles and more about incentives. No government openly says it wants $1 trillion war. Nobody campaigns on that slogan. Yet, large conflicts often emerge from a series of decisions that each appear manageable on their own. One deployment, one retaliation, one emergency authorization.
One more month, one more operation, one more funding package. Then years later, historians connect the dots. The people living through it rarely see the full picture in real time. And that's the unsettling part. The most expensive wars are not always entered deliberately. Sometimes countries drift into them, step by step, expense by expense.
Crisis by crisis. And today, as tensions, oil markets, debt levels, and military commitments continue colliding in the Middle East, one question sits quietly beneath all the headlines. If $1 trillion war doesn't begin with a single decision, how do you know when you're already in one?